Melissa is now going to join us for the final panel session of the afternoon. I have with me here Drs. Andrew Monte, Dr. Kari Rockhill, and Dr. Joshua Black from Rocky Mountain, and we will close the day with hopefully an interactive discussion. So first question to sort of tie all of this together. Clearly, the policies are shifting, and we have evidence that psychedelic use is increasing. What do you think the most important research gap we need to fill is in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, let's start with our scientific minds here.
So I think what Todd's doing with longitudinal data is going to be essential. The real world using these substances it's happening. It will continue to happen, and I think having that benchmark to ensure that as they get used in a real setting, that safety is good and patients are seeing benefit and robust benefit, that it stays.
I agree. I also think having a finger on the change use over time is going to be really important. That's where cross-sectional observational data can come in. And I think the two of them together will be extremely powerful to understand who are we impacting, how are we impacting them, and how is that changing at the population level.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I want to really highlight one of the things that Melissa said earlier. I mean, she was so intelligent in saying that really what we need to do is actually increase conversation. That's almost number one, right? Because the fact of the matter is we have to realize that psychedelics are not going to be right for everybody. And it's not just taking a psychedelic that gets somebody better, right? It's that plus the therapy and the attendant things that are with it. And so we have to actually measure those things and then actually communicate it back to patients so that way we can maximize the effectiveness and maximize the safety at the same time. You know, it's really important for us to understand whether or not use in this clinical trial setting is going to be the same as it is in a state program. And then similarly, what if somebody is just doing this on their own without any other support? I would argue that we're going to see different outcomes across those contexts. So we actually have to be able to characterize those contexts and then actually measure those outcomes.
Melissa, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think something that's quite unpopular that hasn't, none of the panelists have said yet is I would love to see some research on potential harms of this. I think addressing the harms head on, especially with policymakers, it's a perspective that they really appreciate. Let's not play to the fact that it's been said, psychedelics are not going to be for everyone. You might have a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, but maybe you're not a candidate for one reason or another. What are the harms? Let's call that out and let's have a plan for addressing these potential outcomes. So I think real world data is great. We know that clinical trials tend to happen in a bit of a vacuum, but there's all kinds of environmental factors. There's socioeconomic status that could play a role in somebody's mental health. So there's all kinds of outliers that real world data could really be informative of from a policymaker's perspective. But I say let's address the negatives head on. Let's not pretend that this is some miracle cure. I think that's what puts policymakers on their heels when psychedelics are packaged as, oh, this is a thing that's going to save society and cure everyone's mental illness. And in reality, it's not going to, but it can make a big difference in that, where I'm hopeful in seeing a difference in, mental health in this country at least, and see some progress with that. But I would love to see how we have create a plan for how potential harms can be mitigated.
Well said.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, being able to differentiate who might benefit and who might harm. I think Absolutely. That's when you can provide those kinds of tools to clinicians, that would help them ensure that the right people are getting the right treatment.
Awesome. Thank you. Melissa, a question for you. How should the findings we've heard today inform policy development, either at the state level or federally or both?
We almost exclusively swim in the federal lane. I know that lawmakers will be very interested. I'm excited to share some of the what's been presented today with some of the members of Congress that we work with. I think absolutely some real world data is going to be evaluated. I know that we have a lot of excitement in this administration about psychedelics, but we need real plans of action to put some of these policies into place. Training needs to be developed much further. There needs to be uniformity across the board. What does training look like across social work schools in the country, or nursing schools, or medical schools even? What are we talking about? So I think training and education is a really important next step. And, how do you build that workforce to be ready for this when these therapies are available and become online? So I think that events like this are really critical, and now it's on those of us in Washington, D.C. to deliver what has been presented here to members of the PATH caucus and other members of Congress who have been really active in the psychedelic policy space, to really take action on that and to put some pen to paper and get something moving in Washington, D.C.
I would also add, I would really love to see more two-way conversation occurring, because as someone who's actually actively writing surveys on this topic right now, I want to know which data they need to make their policies happen, and they need to have my data to understand the policies. So that two-way conversation, I think, is going to be extremely important to measure the right things at the right time and get it into the hands of the people that need it.
Yeah, and I'll underscore that too. I mean, when we first made Insight, right, like we actually had our local Department of Public Health, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, go through it, and we asked them that specific question: what else do you need to know? And we added content to meet their needs, right? I think that it's really important to highlight a couple of things that we heard about today. First of all, actually, is that just following people in a longitudinal cohort that has people within a state program is actually a relatively small minority of the people that are actually using psychedelics. And so we need to understand that we actually need those broader data collection methods. I mean, if we're going to talk about a very small number here, then we should be characterizing what the impact is on the rest of society as well. And so I think that that's a really important thing. And that's actually what our Department of Public Health asked us for when we went through that.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Rockhill, a question for you. You started to paint the picture of different populations of users and what their different risks might be. How do you think we should tailor public health messaging to address those different population risks?
I'm of the opinion where you have to meet people where they're at. I think that one message does not fit all. And so we're going to have multiple parallel campaigns happening at the same time. I do think that people are curious about these substances, and I think there's going to be psychedelic naive people who are willing to try psychedelics, and maybe they have a different messaging around expected experiences or possible pros and cons that might come up. Whereas someone who's more experienced, you might be more messaging around like services around integration and how do you take this to the next level, things of that nature. So I foresee multiple public health campaigns, multiple avenues of finding people, reaching people. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach.
Anything else from our other panelists?
No, I think it's an important point, though, and I will say something that may be slightly provocative, because we've talked a lot about psychedelics today, and many people are making a case that psychedelics are different than other drugs out there, right? And I think that that's partially true, but I would actually argue that when we sort of think about other medications that have been approved by the FDA, we think about hypertension, for instance, right? It's the most common chronic disease, and what we see is that when a new hypertension medication is introduced to the market, all of a sudden we see adverse events go up. But we have to put that in context, right? And say, okay, yes, but how many people are actually being helped by this? And, so the FDA is actually really good about defining that kind of risk-benefit analysis. But we have to think about the entire spectrum of use and really the harms that are being prevented with use as well.
Okay, Dr. Black. Your work on survey methodology is helping us understand this rapidly evolving landscape. As use becomes more mainstream and potentially more diverse, how do we build measurement systems that can capture the complexity without losing scientific credibility?
Well, I think you start with asking individuals who are experiencing use who are using, what are they experiencing? And I think as use patterns evolve, starting from how people are changing their use over time and what potential outcomes they may be experiencing, that feeds back into the kinds of questions and the kinds of measurements that we need to make to monitor those changes over time. Any new question needs to be well validated, but the way that gets validated depends on the kind of content that you want to measure. So I'm going to validate a question about an adverse event in a different way than I would validate a question about setting of use, like who are you with, and whether you understand, say, like you go to a center that's been licensed. How do you know that the respondent knows that it was licensed or not? That's going to be validated very differently than, say, you had a cardiac experience while using a substance. Those are two totally different kinds of measurements.
I also think transparency is just going to be a huge issue in this space, and I know it's something that us at RMPDS are very committed to, but I would encourage everyone to be very transparent, and I think things will change over time. Like, I think heroin and fentanyl is a great example of like what you are using, what used to be called heroin, now it's mostly fentanyl, and people will change their language, they'll change their perceptions. It's a great use case of how this could change into the psychedelic world and into the future, which means we need to change. And it doesn't mean old data is wrong and new data is better. You just have to be transparent about how you're doing it and why you're doing it. And I think that's going to be super important, especially in the next couple of years as things are rapidly evolving.
And try not to make a measurement do what it's not supposed to do. You measure a certain thing in a certain way, and you may want something else, say a very stigmatized behavior, abuse, physical abuse, or something like that. You have to understand the measurement in its context rather than try to make it what you want it to be, because some things are really hard to measure.
Good point. Okay, Dr. Monte. Your team at Rocky Mountain has built a bunch of innovative methods to look at different tools and assess emerging patterns. As we try to stay ahead of the evolving patterns, how do we balance the need for methodological rigor with the pressure to provide timely insights?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that as a scientist that's hoping to change policy and affect policy, we struggle with this quite a bit, as you know, Kate, right? And so, I would urge people to always look at the data source, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we do this meeting, is to really kind of come out there and talk through the methods. I mean, you heard Joshua spend 2 talks today talking about the rigor that he puts into the methods there, and I'm not sure that everybody does that. Anybody can write a little survey there, but whether or not the survey actually measures what the person wants it to measure is another question entirely. And so, that's that. It's putting the work in and then being transparent around the methodology and what the numbers actually mean. I do think that there are data that come out that are not peer-reviewed that we should be much more wary of, right? We should always be thinking about whom is in the sample when where questions are being asked. And so that's all I can really suggest, is to make the audience educated consumers of the data, and really try to triangulate things as we do with our mosaic methodology.
Anything you would add?
The one thing I would add is, I think putting information out there, even if it's still in process, I think is generally a good thing, because this field is rapidly evolving, and understanding, producing information that gives us the best understanding at this time, but holding it lightly and knowing that the next thing may be either improved or different or changed doesn't invalidate what we saw before. And so you're always using the best information you have to make the decisions that are right in front of you, but at the same time, you're working to improve your measurements, your validity, your rigor, so that the next set of decisions you have to make has even better rigor than before. You're running both of those in parallel. I think gives us the ability to act and also improve.
Yeah, very iterative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Melissa, another question for you. You are seeing rapid policy changes alongside brand new research almost every day. So this is a 2-part question. How should policymakers navigate this landscape where the research is changing quickly? And then the second part of the question is, what is your advice to the researchers to make it easier for the policymakers?
I mean, what was just said, and that was answering the last question, rigor and professionalism. I think the more we act like a traditional type of space, I've said that we are somewhat untraditional and very complex. We are, but also how do we act like other fields act, make sure that what we are studying is necessary and could be useful to people that are in the policymaking position. And ensuring that the quality of the work is really high. Policies are rapidly changing, but also at the federal level, it does feel like there's still a little bit of hesitation about this field, this new sector of healthcare that's getting created, that we need to constantly be leveling up. And that's why I emphasize collaboration so much, because that is a way to show the professionalism of the field. This is how other sectors of healthcare operate. There is this song and dance that we all do together. And with this in the psychedelic field, it's up until I feel like maybe the MAPS decision last year was a wake-up call that we all needed to have. Like, it's not just one thing that needs to succeed. It's all of us really need to succeed in our own lanes to really affect this change and create the outcomes that we want to have, which is safe, affordable access to psychedelics, no matter what format that is. For many people, it'll be in healthcare. For other people, it might be in a state program. For other people, it might be personal use. So I think that it is very iterative. The entire process is very iterative. As the research field is iterative in that you're constantly learning and adapting and changing to new data that comes out. The policy world is the same. It's, we're not going to get everything right in the beginning phases of actual policy making, especially at the federal level. It may not be everything that you want to see the federal government do, but it's incumbent on us as a field to work together to get the federal government and the policymakers at this level to make decisions in a way that is helpful for the field and is helpful for patients and providing that access. And I apologize, I forgot what the first question was in answering the second question. So if you could repeat that one.
I think you answered both. The first part of the question was, what do the policymakers need? And the second part was, what is your advice to the researchers? Maybe the researchers could take an opportunity to answer or ask Melissa a question about how they can improve their work to benefit policy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that we saw two what I would consider failures in Oregon and Colorado. When these bills were first passed, there was no funding for the data collection. Colorado tried to actually put elements that should be monitored in their bill, but they actually didn't attach the funding behind it. And this, stuff does cost money to do, no matter who does it. And so I'm interested to hear about your opinion there, Melissa, on how we can not make that mistake again, and what types of data you think are most important for, the next state that comes forward. I mean, we've got New Mexico coming on board, and then, maybe it's going to be Arizona or California or Massachusetts. We shall see.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to see the state policy landscape evolve in a way. And now we have the American Ibogaine project that is kicking off, which is dipping state level funding into drug development and getting that through the FDA process. So we'll see how successful that is. But I think that you're absolutely dead on about Colorado and Oregon having really a missed opportunity to create those programs to produce the kind of data that the federal government would want to see. I think that would have been tremendously helpful. And I'm not sure if that was predicated on maybe state level budgetary issues at the time, or just a risk aversion to attaching anything with money through the public forum. That's always risky to do. So I think that keeping patient safety first, and anything that is proposed at the state or federal level should be tantamount to everything. It's not necessarily always about the most access as quick as possible. Right. I know that people get frustrated with federal government, especially for how slow they move, but they move slow intentionally, and it's to mitigate any unintended consequences. So I'm very curious about New Mexico. I think that's a different kind of program that is embedded into an interesting state level system. We'll see how that turns out. I believe there is data collection embedded in that, but also, have some rigor around program design with training of individuals who will be administering these treatments to people. Screening would absolutely be something that would make policymakers really comfortable having some rigorous screening in place. So I think every state that comes up for psychedelic reform is going to get better and better. And that is going to actually inform the federal government on how the federal government needs to adapt at this level to what is happening at the state level. So it should be a two-way conversation between lawmakers and the field. And I think we're getting into that phase, especially now at the federal level, where they've spent their time in getting themselves familiarized with this issue. Now we have well-informed Health and Human Services Administration that is very well versed in the field of psychedelics. And now Congress with the PATH caucus is getting there, where they are now looking towards working on operating under a working group model where there will be mechanisms for providing feedback back and forth between policymakers and experts in the field. So I think taking the issue of psychedelic assisted treatments and making it seem as legitimate as possible and using the rigor that traditional science uses would be a great signal to policymakers.
Well, so pushing on that a little bit, then tell me how that framework, there seems to be a juxtaposition a little bit with the state regulated systems and then what our traditional sort of FDA program do, right? That rose up because of a need, right? And so we need to acknowledge that. But I'm interested in your sort of thought between that juxtaposition.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that if members of Congress had it their way, maybe the state programs would slow down a bit. I think they understand that states have the right to do whatever they want, of course, within the bounds of the law and at voter will. But, they know that this train has left the station and they accept it as, this is the state that we're in. How do we ensure that American citizens are as safe as they could possibly be if they decide to participate in a state program? So, it would be great if some federal resources went into state programs like that. Right. I don't know if that's on the table with this administration right now, considering all kinds of budgetary issues. But I think, finding the common ground from state programs to the role that federal government plays is where we need to reside when it comes to marrying state and federal. And I think the data, the training, and patient safety is a lane that everyone can swim in together.
Yeah.
I really only have one more planned question, which I'd like to finish with. So we'll check to see if there's any questions coming in through the online panel, but I thought I would see if there are any questions that you have for each other.
My question to you, Dr. Rockhill, is, we've talked a lot about adult psychedelic use. One thing that we haven't talked much about, although we know we've started to see some signal in our data around young adult and adolescent use. So talk to me a little bit about how we start to measure that and how we think about subsequent outcomes in patients, that use in the adolescent years, which actually is really quite common, I think we know.
Yeah. I do think understanding use patterns is very possible in adolescents. I personally would bring academia into that conversation. I would love to understand mechanisms more in adolescents, particularly in brain development and, I would say mechanisms of these substances in general at the academic world would be great to bring to the table because each of these substances do act on the brain differently, do act in the body differently. But for the developing brain and understanding how people progress or don't progress, I think would be really, really influential to understand how this interacts with other substances, how it interacts with development, mental health. We know we have a mental health crisis among adolescents right now. So I think there's a place for surveys and I think there's a place for understanding use patterns. But me personally, I think this is a great space for academia to step in, which are the more traditional mechanistic, studies.
Any other questions for each other?
Joshua, what do you think that the hardest area of validity that we're facing right now in our large population work? Where would you say that's the hardest to tackle?
I think discriminant validity is always really challenging. So convergent and divergent validity are kind of on a spectrum of discrimination. So you want an item to measure what you want it to, but the challenge is you don't want it to measure what you don't want it to. So discriminating between, say, someone who is using, say they use non-medically initially because they're not, say they're using an opioid, they have pain, their initial prescription isn't giving them enough, and so they use a couple more, and then they go back to the physician and say, oh, I need some more, and so they change their prescription. So now they're using medically, but before they weren't using, they were using non-medically, and so crafting a measurement that discriminates that kind of overtime nuance is really going to be challenging. So I think if there's a place where it's most challenging as a field overall, really, and we're not special in that, is making sure that you're not measuring what you don't want to measure.
No.
I was going to say, my question for Melissa would be, like, how easy do you think it is to change something that's already been put into policy? So I think there could be, you sometimes from a researcher's external standpoint, it feels like we got one shot at making a policy work, and then it's going to be set in stone for years to come. Do you think this field will be any different? Will we have the opportunity to iterate on policy to improve it, year over year, or do we get one shot at one bill to make, create a legal paradigm, and that's what we're going to be stuck with for 20 years?
Yeah, it depends on what mandate you're trying to create. Like, I think if the emphasis was we're just trying to create access and that's the goal, that's going to be very hard to claw back. If we are focused on creating a legitimate system within healthcare, as long as I think that the goal is tied to what we want to see, there's opportunities all the time to make adjustments to any kind of regulation that gets put into place. I think that it seems like the psychedelic space, at least those who are working at the federal level, really want the right things to happen. I know that the government will probably err on the side of being more conservative, so it's going to take adjustments to open things up a bit more. I know that if the goal is to get more research funding, it might not be the amount of research funding that we really need to do a rigorous study, but it's a starting point. So as long as we are creating starting points for us that are in line with what the end outcomes we want, policies are adjusted all the time, and it might take that incremental change and a certain cadence from advocates and the research community to get to exactly what we want, but I think we're on track, and I know it does seem a little doomsday at times, and you do have one chance to make a first impression, but I think the psychedelic space has done a pretty decent job at presenting the right information the right way, and it's just going to be incumbent on us to be in conversation with the government constantly. That's honestly why I even created my organization, to have a hub for the psychedelic field to go to in Washington, D.C., because we're not going to get it right. New data is going to come out. We're all still very much in the learning phase from our different perspectives that we sit at. So I think that this is, as long as we remain engaged with our state and federal governments, and I think that there's a lot of energy for that right now, and I hope that kind of carries through as we make more and more progress. It's just going to be an iterative process, just as much as like the research is an iterative process.
Thank you. Okay, one last question. if funding weren't an issue, I know that's out there, but if it weren't an issue, what's one research question or policy question about psychedelics that you want answered most?
I'll go first. I think if funding were not an issue at all, which is a fantasy land, I don't really even know if that exists, but I think that the diagnostic, learning about research about diagnostic, like who should get what and how, I think that could be seriously impactful. And I think that might be one of the bigger questions about psychedelics is like, which one is for anxiety, which one has big impact for anxiety in women? You know, like that is an answer that can have big impact on society and create a lot of efficiencies and mitigate a lot of harms on. So I think diagnosis is a place that needs to be much more explored.
Great.
I was going to say that.
You were?
I was.
Sorry, I stole your answer.
It's all good. But I got a second one, which I think I would love to see 20-year outcome research. Like, we're what, barely 10 years out of recreational marijuana in Colorado. And so setting up a cohort now of it, but both individuals who are using, not using, and have the capacity to begin using over a 20-year period, 30-year period to show multiple outcomes, multiple, as you all keep hearing me talk about, outcome-wide epidemiology, like show improvement across cognitive function, mental health function, physical, behavioral, socioeconomic, flourishing. A large study that shows the long-term effects, I think, would be groundbreaking and very expensive.
Yeah, I would always plug populations that cannot be included in clinical trials. I know I have a personal interest in pregnant and postpartum women in my research, but there are specific populations that are intentionally excluded. And so, all money aside, it would be great to have essentially like rigorous longitudinal data collection among these special populations. I think that also applies to certain mental health conditions. Schizophrenia is one. There's just so many, I think, that have like really targeted research questions that can be so informative on the who are the right people for this.
Yeah, all these statements around, essentially personalized care are really speak to my heart, right? My PhD is in genetics, and so I really sort of have spent a lot of time thinking about how to maximize effectiveness and safety in individual patients, and so I agree with that. And and in addition to that, I think that I'm really interested in the different frameworks and the different factors that do contribute to the outcomes that Joshua's mentioned. Because inherently somebody within a state program is going to be different than somebody that's using at home that may be actually still getting therapy, right? And they're going to be different than the person that's going down the road to Red Rocks just using and drinking a lot of alcohol with it. And so, but there are factors around all of those use that we need to be able to characterize. So it's granular data in populations that characterize the outcomes that are important down the line. And cohort studies aren't going to be able to do that all on their own because inherently we're focusing on trying to just capture people in this narrow band, a small subset of people that are in the state programs and the small subset of people that are in clinical trials. And so coming back to your expertise, Kari, like the population work that actually has granular data, and then your sort of concepts and ideas about bringing those into longitudinal programs is just really exciting to me. And so I think that's where we're going. But it really takes a big data type of approach like what you've described.
All right, thank you. That wraps up our afternoon panel. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you attendees for your time today. We will turn it back over to Dr. Dart for our closing remarks.
Great, thank you. Thanks to the group, that was a great example. But thank you also to all of our attendees today. Now, please watch your email for a follow-up survey. We really do use those every year to help guide our agenda development. Please share your ideas and questions. We take anything. Also, the recordings and presentation materials will be made available, and we'll appreciate your engagement, and we invite you to share follow-up questions with the email address in the chat, as I said. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you. And this is the end of our event.